Beginning in the late 1860s, following the U.S. Civil War and the end of slavery, more than a dozen African Americans were elected to Congress. Joseph Rainey of South Carolina was the first African American in the U.S. House of Representatives. Hiram Revels of Mississippi, the first in the Senate. But soon a patchwork of state restrictions was in place that made it all but impossible for most blacks to vote. Without black votes, black candidates couldn't win. The last African American congressman from that era was out of office by 1901.
Blacks in these deep South states were a sizable portion of the population, and taking away those protections, those federal protections, really allowed states to run rampant over black voting rights. And what they did was essentially make black people second-class citizens.
From the late 1920s through the 30s and 40s, a few African Americans from northern states were elected to the U.S. House. But even into the 1950s, it was still big news for an African American to be elected to any public office, especially in the South.
Nationwide headlines were made with the election of Atlanta University President Dr. Rufus Clement to the Georgia City's Board of Education. The first Negro voted to public office here since Reconstruction days.
By the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement was underway, and in 1965, the landmark Voting Rights Act became law. Through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, more blacks were elected to public office, making history as governors, mayors, and members of Congress. In 1967, Edward Brooke of Massachusetts became the first black U.S. senator since Reconstruction. In 1969, Shirley Chisholm became the first African-American woman elected to the U.S. Congress, and she ran for president in 1972.
So when the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965 is when you start to see that first wave of black elected officials, both locally and at the federal level. You start to see blacks starting to flex their political power in cities and states across the country.
Congressmen like John Lewis and James Clyburn became civil rights icons.
My goodness, those of us who come to these positions, we come to them knowing full well that we have a burden to make sure that we do it in such a way that there will be people coming after us.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
In 2008, the final barrier was broken when Barack Obama was elected U.S. president. And now a new era has arrived. Kamala Harris is the first black woman elected vice president, while newly elected Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia helped swing the U.S. Senate for Democrats.
When we have these offices that have been inhabited by the same people, by the same white guys, it really limits our imagination. I think it's important to see different kinds of people serving in different positions because you can imagine possibility.
The possibility that for black Americans anything is achievable, including a voice at all levels of government. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Bethesda, Maryland.